Hi, welcome to Exploring the Illusion of Free Will. My name is George. I'm here with my co-host Nomi, and we've got an announcement to make. Our guest for today's taping has agreed to be our co-host on future episodes. So I'd like to introduce you to John.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now for this episode, we're going to call this Causal reality discussion number one. We'll be having these like extemporaneous talks where we're not like talking about any specific topic, but just bringing it all together. And so let's do that now. Okay. So now, John, when we present the assertion that that reality is causal and hence human will must be causal, to your mind, what comes as what might be one of the stronger kind of like viewpoints that would differ from that that would argue for free will?
That would argue for free will?
Right.
I'm a little confused by that question because I'm not much of a historian, as I believe you are, a historian of philosophy. I'm sort of just drawing out of my own personal experience. So I'm very much attached to first-person experience. Not that I'm not fascinated by sociology and biology, and I read it and I study it, but I'm very aware that I don't have access to the cells in my body, right? I know I'm made of cells, or the subatomic level of that, but I am able to read and think and feel and smell, taste, touch, and all of that. So I think those first-person experiences, just like I made that quote from the elephant sliding down the hill. The physicist looks at the numbers of the weight of the elephant, the speed, and the incline, and all those numbers do not capture the poetry of the elephant sliding down the hill. So I think information is not meaning. To have meaning, you have to have a meaning maker. So I think we are all making up maps as we go along. But for me, I believe in, you could fill this out as people start to evolve, and I do believe they do evolve in the direction of greater and greater complexity, that the conflicts and impasses and dilemmas and paradoxes that all flesh is heir to, we have to we come up with different theories about those. And I just find it, seems to be, I think, as people evolve, an acceptance of that paradox where they feel like they have no choice but to do what they did, even if it may have been a great risk to themselves. And I was just thinking of this man. This is a few years back, a true story. In the subway on 42nd Street, there was a man who had an epileptic seizure, and everyone thought he was feeling fine, he was better, but as he walked towards the train track, he slipped and fell onto the train track. And another man, and the train was coming into the station, another man jumped on top of him, covered up his body, and arranged it in a way that the train went over them, and both of them, neither one of them were hurt. Now afterwards, when they interviewed this man about why did you do that, or what were you thinking of, he says, what all people, and what a hero you are, he says, what all people do who do those kinds of things. He says, oh, I wasn't thinking at all. I had no choice at all. Anyone would have done what I did.
That's not true, isn't it?
But I just find that, so he's like an ordinary, extraordinary person, just as we all are. And history's full of people who, did what they had to do because it was choiceless for them. It was a choiceless choice. And, so sometimes you have to pay a high price, or sometimes there's a great risk. But I think that, I hope I'm answering your question to some extent.
Well, I'm not sure, because basically you're describing how the person did what he had to do, again, because he had to do it. And, I would describe it as a moral imperative. He saw it as right, and he couldn't, in his mind, conceive of not doing it? In other words, like if there was greater risk, if there was substantially greater risk that he would not have been able to succeed, that might have changed his.
But I don't think there was any deliberation. He said there was no deliberation at all. There was just an action. And he believed that anyone in that circumstance would have done the same. And so I'm wondering how free was his will. There was definitely will there, but whether it was free or not, I think is a compelling question, because I think as people, evolve, they're much more, they can be very selfless in their actions, and it doesn't fit the sort of competitive norm that we were brought up with in this very capitalist, me-first, narcissistic society, where you see people surrendering that in certain probably emergencies or certain kind of circumstances. But I was wondering if you could fill us in a little bit about...
I mean, the way I would understand that amazing behavior is that that man was highly evolved human being. Susan Cook-Reuter would say that he was among the people who are at unitive level of conscious development. And she also has other levels. We start as impulsive, self-defensive, conformist, self-conscious, conscientious, individualist, autonomous, construct-aware, and then the final is unity, where you feel oneness with all. So for that person, somebody else in that kind of situation, he just felt that he was in that situation, and he was feeling that amazing connection that human beings can feel.
Well, you're raising something, I think, an interesting point, that there are these different levels, but not everyone lives at that highest level all the time. Mm-hmm. So everyone may have a moment of unitive consciousness.
Right, right.
That may not be where they're at all the time.
Right, and then in our future episodes, we will perhaps bring in Wilbur Combs' lattice, where they talk about different levels of development and different states of consciousness, and anybody at any level of consciousness development can have a very complex state of consciousness. For instance, somebody who is at an egocentric level of development can have a very non-dual experience, but that would be momentary. But with practice and by bringing in all the relevant causes, we can perhaps stabilize that level of development and make it a permanent state. So traits can become states of consciousness can become stages of development. And I think human beings all of us are capable of that. But unfortunately, that level is achieved by very few. Throughout history, you can always count them on fingers.
Okay. Basically, we have a person who does something, and you say that it was done without reflection. Okay.
That's what he claimed.
Right.
It was like a few seconds where this event occurred.
Okay. But then the question becomes, all right, let's say it was without conscious reflection. What's interesting, you guys are probably familiar with the research. There's more and more research in neuroscience that demonstrates that it could be that all our decisions, every one that we make, is really made at the level of the unconscious.
You're talking about Libet's...
Libet, sure, and John Bard's, a lot of priming studies.
And this is very controversial, the conclusions that they...
It's controversial in the same sense that that evolution is controversial. In other words, there's some within us that are within the creationist model that, my God, believing in evolution to them is consigning them to a potential eternity in hellfire. I mean, if you believe that you're going to hell, if you have a certain belief, chances are you wouldn't believe that. So, but with these experiments, the Libet's experiment, for example, that demonstrates that empirically with imaging apparatus and all, that the unconscious is clearly making is clearly active. Is clearly making the choice. There's some that claim that there's like a period of time in which the consciousness could enter into the equation and make the decision. But that's a claim. That's a claim without any empirical validation. Whereas all the empirical work that has been done, suggests that at least in motor action, with intent, that the intent is actually, the moment of intent is decided by the unconscious.
Right. And that's the sensory motor apparatus at that level, because not all choices that people make are those kinds of snap
Exactly.
decisions like the man made on that platform. There may be other uh, decisions that he makes
Yeah.
about
John,
who to
I
vote
wanna-
for, or what kind of
I hear
house to buy, or what kind of clothes to wear,
No.
which are different kinds of
Right.
choices.
No, I know, but the reason I mentioned that, John Barge is, for example, there are choices like there's an experiment. Two groups, they are assigned the task of making sentences out of words. That's what they're
Priming.
told. That's what they're told, and some of them have in their choice of words, in their list of words, bingo, elderly, aged, old, whatever, those kinds of words. The other group, let's say, didn't, had, let's say, youthful or whatever. And so, like, after the experiment, which is actually part of the experiment in this case, they were observed walking to the elevator, on their way home, whatever. And, amazingly, the people who had been primed with the words of elderly, bingo, and all that associated with being old, they walked to the elevator more slowly than the other group. So this idea that the unconscious, and it's done naturally at an unconscious level, because when they're asked, well, why did they walk to the elevator more closely? Actually, there's a different experiment where they asked for a reason, but when they're asked for the reasons why they do things, they construct, they guess, but they don't get it right that actually they were primed by the psychologist to choose as they did. So you're right, John, that that Libet's experiment has to do with the motor behavior, but there's a mountain of evidence. I mean, going back to Freud with hypnosis, that we have this unconscious that that takes part in every decision we make. It seems, because otherwise, if the unconscious doesn't sleep.
Well, I think that's very crucial, the interplay between the unconscious and what we're calling the conscious. Maybe on a spectrum, it's not either or, but a little bit of both and maybe neither on some occasions. Performances that are spectacularly effective, like at the piano or sports or whatever, usually were worked on for a long, long time before it became so spectacular. So there had to have been motivation, there had to have been a way of practicing, getting mentoring or whatever before anyone becomes great at something. But you had to play scales for a very long time before it gets into that sensory motor, that basic system, before the higher functions of higher creativity can emerge.
Right, but John, are you introducing that to present the case in which the person would have a free will?
I'm sort of making an analogy, I guess, between the conscious and the unconscious aspects of our experience, and how there are external forces that may be, seeding ideas, and storytellers and magicians and hypnotists and politicians and our parents and our teachers have been doing this all along.
Right, again.
And we get mixed results. Some things are very beneficial, some things may end up being very destructive, depending on what level of development those people are. That's part of our social brains,
Right, but John,
we don't live in isolation from anyone else.
We have the unconscious, we have the consciousness, we also have like collective consciousness, our society molding us. But again, for the consideration to be relevant, we would have to have some kind of understanding as to how that distinction of whether the behavior was unconscious, conscious, or combination, whatever, would affect its causality. In other words, like, for example, let's say a decision is completely conscious, completely. Let's say, and I don't believe that's possible according to the research, but let's say it was. Okay, if it was completely conscious, then we know that causality is still the basic process of change in the universe. So that conscious decision would have been based on a previous, on something, on a previous event, a previous memory, a previous learning that's conscious, on a causal chain that leads back to before the person was born. we can apply the exact same reasoning to the unconscious. We can apply the exact same reasoning to the collective consciousness. So regardless of how we define our consciousness or not, it's all encompassed by causality. Nothing escapes it. So we can kind of like explore the various kinds ways we make decisions. But again, we have to reach the conclusion that the decisions are ultimately causally willed and not freely willed.
Well, yeah, I'm just suggesting that there are causes and effects, but there also the effects also then can become causes, and we have then loops and multiple causes.
Right.
And where I think reductionism, the evil of reductionism is that when you reduce all this complexity to a single kind of cause, like the firing of neurons in your brain, I think it's much more complex than that.
Or a single kind of process, perhaps. George is saying that, causality is involved at all levels of reality.
Right, different kinds of causes.
Right.
And John, when you see that, like, again, we're considering causes in the immediate sense as epiphenomenon, in that, it seems to us that what's happening around us is what's causing things to happen. But then if we take the entirety of the universe as our subjects for consideration, and consider that, the state of that universe from one moment to the next must be completely causal, that the state of the universe at this moment is completely causing the state of the universe at the next moment, then we reach the conclusion, well, if that's the case, then whatever might happen or not, however we might understand it or not, within that universe must also be causal. Because how could otherwise a part of the universe, of a universe that's completely causal, somehow disentangle itself or separate itself from that causal unit to behave and then the question would come, if it's not causal, how would it be behaving? The only other option logically or scientifically is randomly. And then when we ask ourselves, well, what is randomness? And depending on what kind of definition we give, we realize that what we define as random must also be caused. Because if something that happened randomly was uncaused, how could something not be caused? So John, the basic point is that understanding this from within the perspective of the universe in its entirety, that kind of like allows us to subsume everything within the universe to the universe.
But which universe? I mean, there's the inner universe, and then there's the outer universe. I mean, you look at the subatomic, the activity of subatomic particles. When I was studying physics when I was a little kid, we had those like orbital sort of those little blocks moving around. It doesn't look like that anymore. It looks like a mist or a blur.
Right.
And they don't even know where they can locate the particle. It's a probability, right? Then you have other maps. You have a biological map where you're looking at a cell which is emerging out of this prebiotic soup, and then the cell wall, a membrane emerges with their holes in it, and there are molecules that can, certain size molecules that can come in. Some can't come in. Some of those molecules go out. So you have an interior and an exterior, or an external or an internal, however you want to phrase it. But I think this is very significant as we become psychological beings, where we experience a subjective inside, my thoughts, feelings, fantasies, sensations, which are not yours. And yet we can communicate about them, verbally and non-verbally, in many different ways. So I think it gets, I think, everything causes everything else.
Right.
And I think I'm fine with that. But it's not from outside of the universe. It seems to me like you're describing something like the view from nowhere, as Thomas Nagel would call it. And that's this objectivist stance. Comes from nowhere. and I think we have to have a perspective coming from that's embodied for this stuff to make sense, because it can become really crazy very quickly if we don't ground it in our embodiment, and we have a perspective which evolves and changes and can include others. And
How can we ground it?
well, we're talking about meditation, and there are different schools of meditation and different kinds of practices. There's body work, and there's art, the arts, and certainly science. I mean, there are highly creative and very imaginative people like Einstein, a very imaginative man, who thought, theories should be beautiful and elegant.
Right.
So he thought, he brought his aesthetic sensibility. He created these experiments, these thought experiments, these visualizations, basically, and then the math came, and the experiments came that corroborated all of that. So he's an excellent example of someone in the hard sciences that was using his imaginative capacity. So
as we are moving from atoms to molecules to cells to organs, we are also moving up the scale in complexity, and at each level we see new properties emerging.
right, like the interiors.
Right.
And the interior universe, in more evolved people, is as vast as the external universe.
Okay, but
I think they mirror one another in complexity.
again, we can talk about like the level of complexity going from the most basic to the most complex, but the key continues. The key point continues to be that every level is causal. And John, you raised the question of what universe we were referring to when I brought in the idea of the state of the universe. Compelling the future states. By my understanding, when we use the word universe technically, most literally uni meaning one, that there is only one reality. There may be dimensions of that reality that we're not in touch with at all. That's possible, that those dimensions would nevertheless have to be part of that one reality. That's actually the foundation of Judaism. God being one, whatever. Maybe it plays out in other religions also. But again, the crucial point, John, though, is that regardless of whether we're discussing the universe literally in its entirety or other quote-unquote universes, would they not all have to be causal? Would the consideration be inconsequential because any other kind of quote-unquote universe must also be causal?
Like when you said that there are different ways to embody the level of consciousness that you were mentioning. So you mentioned meditation, you mentioned art, you mentioned science. So you are mentioning causal conditions which will make that emergence more probable.
Okay.
Would you agree with that?
That sounds good to me.
Like what George's point is that at every level causality is operative. Even if we want to have higher states of consciousness, we do need to meditate. We do need to learn. We do need to move beyond the egocentric or the ethnocentric levels of thinking and consciousness. So causality rules.
All right. Well, I mean,
I'm working on it.
Right, and it's good, John, because that you have any manner of doubt, and personally, I mean, I understand this, I think, relatively completely intellectually. Cause and effect. All you have to do to understand the nature of human will is to understand cause and effect. That everything else is a commentary.
But I think we are. Where does this fit in? That we are participant observers. We are observing, and through our observing, we are also participating, because we change what we observe through our observing. This is, isn't this Heisenberg or somebody, one of these physicists?
Right. But that's all right.
So you can't separate the observer, the observation, the observing. You can't separate the dancer from the dance.
Okay, but with Heisenberg and
I think there's a
principle,
tendency, the objective stance tends to do that, sort of kills the butterfly, to that then describe how it worked.
But no,
it's
no,
dead.
no,
You
no,
know, it's
John,
not alive
it's not,
anymore.
it's not like, all right, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle basically states that you can't measure simultaneously the position and momentum of a particle. That's true. But physics understands, even quantum physics, that that particle behavior is absolutely causal. You know,
But well, the one thing I wanted to sort of clarify is that's beyond our human scale. We have instruments that can detect that, the very large and the very small, in the external cosmos. There are different kinds of practices that allow you to contact the interior cosmos. So when you say there's only one universe, I'm using the word cosmos. Wilbur would spell it with a K, cosmos with a K. You're talking about both of those that are unified. And then I can say, yes, there's one universe, one cosmos, if you're including the interiors and the exteriors and not privileging one over the other and splitting our world into a subject-object dichotomy, which I think we all are suffering from.
well, John, yeah, no, when I say universe, it encompasses everything.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you for
absolutely.
clarifying that, because a lot of this, is beyond our human scale. It's part of our genius as a species, though, that we can create telescopes, we can create microscopes, and look at the behavior or the activity of things that are beyond our human scale. But we can somehow translate it into maps that we can understand. But it's harder and harder to do that because a lot of this stuff at very smaller and very large we can't visualize it. We can't imagine it even. And I think we have mathematical models.
Right.
But
in future, I
but
think
that's a
we are going
dilemma to communicate from those.
Okay, yeah, and
we are going to mention creativity because in future episodes we are going to explore how can we become more creative. What are the processes and causes involved in that emergence?
Okay, that's all we have time for today. Thanks, and we'll be back exploring the illusion of free will. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.